name is Jackson Darbo, and this is my audience. Should the average American be allowed to own a firearm? Your reaction to this question will set you on either side of the spectrum for the rest of this speech. The Second Amendment is part of the original Bill of Rights, an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, and gives you your right to bear arms. The recent mass shootings that have happened across the country and been publicized so much by all the different media has something that has brought forth a bunch of emotional voices coming from either side and giving some false narratives to either side as well. The right to own a firearm in the U.S. is part of what makes this country unique, but also poses a bunch of problems when these two emotional sides come together. I'm going to tell you exactly what the Second Amendment says in the Constitution, why this legislation is so vague when it's interpreted, and what has led to the two sides that we have today. Next slide. And the right to bear arms is one that was instituted for a very practical application. The Founding Fathers were gun owners themselves, and this is exactly what the Constitution says. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed upon. So these men were very influenced by Enlightenment thinkers in Europe from the centuries before, and one of the ideas is from John Locke, which is summarized by Megan Parker in her article, Why We Have the Second Amendment. If a government fails to protect its citizens' collective life, liberty, and property, the people have a responsibility to overthrow the government. And so that shows you that the Second Amendment is a very literal, physical interpretation of the people having the power over their own government. This amendment was provided to protect two things. It's to protect the people from the government and from each other when they decide not to follow the other laws that have been put into place. Now that you have some background, I'll move into the gray areas that have arisen from interpreting this law. Next slide, please. So the main thing, the real stem of the issue of gun control is whether it should be a collective right or an individual right. A collective right is the type of right that basically protects the people as a whole. So this would be if maybe you didn't necessarily have the right to have a gun to yourself, but the police and the military had guns, and so it would give you the collective protection that you would get from your Second Amendment gun rights. Now, this is the way that it's been interpreted most recently by courts, and it is that the Second Amendment is actually an individual right. And so this actually brings a new problem of its own, in that, and Adam Winkler writes on the problem that follows in the individual right afforded by the court in Michigan Law Review. No right is absolute, and the extent to which legislation can permissibly burden a right is largely determined by the doctrine, rules, tests, and other devices courts adopt to implement the right. So what that is basically saying is that these courts have to decide how this individual right will be like, you can't just say you can have a gun, that's period, that's it. You have to have a little bit of regulation and where it can basically where is the line being drawn to where you can't have one anymore. So this has led to the courts kind of throwing it down to the state legislatures by implementing what is called reasonable regulation. So states have the power to implement reasonable regulation, which is where their legislatures can decide on what is a reasonable regulation for the gun laws that they've implemented. So this is just an example of where it's being passed off, and it's led to some more of these emotional things that people are saying, and so the next thing I'll talk about is the two different sides of the argument. Next slide, please. The simple explanation of the gun argument is that there are those who are for the Second Amendment and those who are against it. And so Katarzyna Kalinska cites in her sociological perspectives that according to a bunch of public opinion polls, attitudes toward gun control have been stable since the 1960s. And this is pretty interesting because this actually correlates with when the AR-15 was introduced to the public around 1959-1960 by Colt. And it also shows a lot of these polls actually showed that many people that were anti-gun weren't anti-gun as a whole, but anti-assault weapons. And another thing that's kind of hurt the pro-gun people is that those who are for the Second Amendment are usually either all for gun-owning weapons, and they don't want to compromise whatsoever because they believe it'll be a slippery slope and they'll lose their guns altogether. And then for the most part on the opposite side is most people believe, the people on the other side, aside from a couple extremists, believe that guns just probably need to be regulated a little bit more than they are right now. And this is reflected in a lot of states like California, which, as stated in John Woolfolk's article, The Mercury News, it is illegal to buy or possess military-style assault rifles. Those are generally designed as semi-automatic firearms with pistol grips and detachable multi-round ammunition clips. And this is the type of legislation that's getting put into in a bunch of different states across the country. And this is actually a map here that'll show you kind of how strict gun laws are. In the darker the state, is usually the more laws that they have pertaining to it. So the issue of gun rights is one that, without a currently presented answer, and the problem is even worse because of the lack of willingness to compromise from both sides of the equation. So where do you feel that you fall into the spectrum? Now that you have a little bit more insight on these laws, I hope that you can make a better informed decision on gun control.